It's 133 BC, and a Roman tribune named Tiberius Gracchus has just come back from a military campaign in Spain, riding through the Italian countryside on his way back to Rome, and what he sees disturbs him deeply. The small family farms that used to define the Italian landscape, the plots that Roman soldiers had been fighting and dying to protect for generations, are gone. In their place are these enormous estates stretching as far as you can see, owned by wealthy Roman senators and worked almost entirely by slaves. Tiberius had grown up understanding that Rome's strength came from its citizen farmers, the men who tilled their own land in peacetime and picked up a sword when the Republic called. What he's riding through now looks nothing like that Rome. These estates had a name, latifundia, and the way the Roman elite had assembled them was so nakedly corrupt that it's almost hard to believe nobody had burned the whole system down sooner. See, Rome had something called ager publicus, public land, technically owned by the Roman state and meant to be made available to Roman citizens. The legal limit on how much of it any one person could hold was already on the books, capped at around 300 acres. But wealthy senators had spent decades simply ignoring that limit, using their political connections to claim far more than they were entitled to, absorbing public land into their private holdings piece by piece, until these latifundia covered enormous stretches of Italy. Nobody with the power to stop it had any interest in stopping it. Meanwhile, the small farmers who actually had a legal claim to this land were off fighting Rome's wars. Rome was expanding aggressively during this period. Spain, North Africa, Greece, and the legions doing that expanding were drawn primarily from the citizen farmer class, men who left their land for years at a time to serve the Republic. When they finally came home, they found their farms had been bought out at rock-bottom prices while they were gone, or simply rendered unviable because they couldn't compete with estates running on slave labor. So they sold. Or they walked away. They drifted into Rome and joined the growing mass of landless poor crowding into the city, disconnected from the land and from the military eligibility that land ownership provided. Rome was simultaneously getting richer and hollowing itself out, and the people getting richer knew exactly what was happening and didn't care. Tiberius Gracchus looked at all of this and decided to do something about it. He wasn't a radical by nature. He came from one of Rome's most distinguished families. His father had been a celebrated general and consul, and his mother was Cornelia, daughter of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. He wasn't some outsider agitator. He was Roman aristocracy, which is part of what made what he proposed so threatening to the Senate. In 133 BC, as tribune of the plebs, Tiberius put forward a land reform bill that would enforce the existing legal limits on public land holdings, cap individual claims at around 300 acres with a modest allowance for sons, and redistribute the excess to landless Roman citizens in smaller plots they couldn't sell off. It was, by any reasonable standard, a moderate proposal that simply asked the wealthy to follow a law that was already supposed to be in effect. The Senate lost its mind. These men owned the land in question. The redistribution Tiberius was proposing would come directly out of their pockets and their power, and they had no intention of allowing it. They found their weapon in a fellow tribune named Marcus Octavius, who had apparently been persuaded, or more likely paid, to veto the bill. Under Roman law, any tribune could veto any legislation, and that was that. Tiberius tried to negotiate. Octavius refused every compromise. So Tiberius did something that had never been done before. He called a vote to remove Octavius from the tribuneship entirely, arguing that a tribune who acted against the interests of the people had forfeited the office the people gave him. It was constitutionally murky, and Tiberius knew it, but he pushed it through anyway. Octavius was removed. The land reform bill passed. The Senate refused to fund it. They allocated a budget so small it was essentially a public insult, enough to accomplish almost nothing. Tiberius looked for another way forward and found one when the king of Pergamon died and left his kingdom and treasury to Rome. Tiberius moved to redirect those funds toward the land commission without Senate approval, which was another serious breach of convention. The Senate was building its case when Tiberius announced he would run for a second consecutive tribuneship, technically illegal under Roman tradition. They had what they needed. On the day of the election, the Pontifex Maximus, a man named Scipio Nasica, stood up in the Senate and declared that Tiberius was an enemy of the state. He pulled his toga over his head in a ritual gesture and walked out. and a mob of senators and their clients followed him straight to the Capitol where Tiberius was standing with his supporters. They grabbed whatever was at hand, chairs, broken furniture, and beat Tiberius Gracchus and roughly 300 of his supporters to death right there on the steps. His body was thrown into the Tiber that night, denied even a proper Roman burial. It was the first time Romans had killed one of their own elected officials, and the senators who did it had just shown everyone in the Republic that violence was now a legitimate political tool. Gaius Gracchus had watched his brother get murdered by a mob of senators, and for years he said almost nothing about it. He stayed out of Rome's most dangerous political fights, kept his head down, and let people wonder what exactly he was planning. He was around 20 years old when Tiberius died, and by the time he won his own tribuneship in 123 BC, he had spent a decade watching how the Senate operated, learning exactly where his brother had gone wrong, and building the kind of patient, calculated anger that is far more dangerous than the hot kind. Tiberius had been brilliant but impulsive, and the Senate had isolated him and then killed him for it. Gaius was not going to make the same mistake. The first thing Gaius understood that his brother had not was that you cannot fight the richest and most powerful institution in the ancient world with a single constituency. Tiberius had relied almost entirely on the rural poor, the dispossessed farmers who had flooded into Rome after losing their land to the great estates, and when the Senate moved against him, there was nobody else in his corner. Gaius spent his tribuneship building a coalition that was almost impossible to attack from any single direction. He passed a grain law that sold subsidized wheat to the citizens of Rome at a fixed, government-controlled price, and this was enormously popular, immediately and obviously, in a city full of people who spent most of their income on bread. He pushed land reform further, created new colonial settlements to give the landless poor somewhere to actually go, and began a massive public works program building roads across Italy, which put contractors and laborers and suppliers all directly in debt to his political project. He even tried to extend Roman citizenship to Rome's Latin allies, which would have expanded his voting base enormously and given the Italian population a legal stake in Roman politics for the first time. The Senate hated every single piece of this, but they couldn't easily attack it because ordinary Romans loved it, and Gaius had made sure that ordinary Romans knew exactly who to thank. So the Senate did something clever and deeply cynical. They found a tribune named Livius Drusus, a man willing to serve as a political instrument, and they pointed him at Gaius like a weapon. Drusus began proposing legislation that was even more generous than whatever Gaius had just offered. More colonies, better terms, bigger promises to the poor. The goal was not to actually deliver any of this. The goal was to make Gaius look moderate by comparison, and to fragment his coalition by convincing people that they could get everything Gaius was offering and more, without the controversy that came with supporting him. It worked. Gaius also made a tactical error by spending critical months in Carthage, overseeing the establishment of a new colony, leaving Rome at exactly the wrong moment, and when he came back, the political ground had shifted under him. He failed to win re-election to a third tribuneship, and just like that, without a formal charge ever being filed against him, his legal protection evaporated. What followed was fast and brutal. Gaius's supporters clashed with the Senate's forces on the Aventine Hill, and the Senate responded by passing the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree that had never been used before in Roman history, essentially authorizing the consuls to do whatever was necessary to defend the state. In practice, this meant that the Senate had just declared that Gaius Gracchus and his supporters were enemies of Rome, stripping them of any legal protection and authorizing their deaths. Gaius fled across the Tiber with a small number of followers, and when it became clear there was nowhere left to run, he asked a loyal slave named Philocrates to kill him. The Senate then announced a bounty on his head, quite literally his head's weight in gold, and a senator named Septimius collected it, reportedly filling the skull with lead first to increase the payout. Around 3,000 of Gaius's supporters were subsequently arrested and executed without trial, without charges, without any pretense of the legal process that Rome claimed to represent. The ruling class had now demonstrated something important twice in a single decade. They could kill reformers. They could also dismantle everything the reformers built and punish anyone who had helped them. And they could do all of this while the gap between the wealthy and everyone else kept getting wider. What they could not do, and what they seemed not to understand, was that the inequality that had produced the Gracchi brothers had not gone anywhere. It was still there, still growing, still creating exactly the kind of desperate population that ambitious men could exploit. What the Gracchi had tried to fix with legislation, men like Marius and Sulla, and eventually Julius Caesar would try to fix with armies, and that is a far messier solution. By 1789, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was producing nearly half of all the sugar consumed in Europe, and the men getting rich off of it had no intention of changing anything about how it worked. The numbers alone are staggering. The western third of the island of Hispaniola, a chunk of land roughly the size of Maryland, was generating around 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half its coffee, making it, by any honest accounting, the single most profitable colonial possession on the planet. French merchants, plantation owners, and the crown itself were pulling extraordinary wealth out of that soil, and to understand how, you have to look at the arithmetic underneath all of it. There were roughly 500,000 enslaved people on that island. Against them, only about 30,000 white colonists, planters, merchants, minor officials, living on top of a system so violent and so total that it required constant daily brutality just to keep running. And then sitting uncomfortably in the middle, there were approximately 30,000 free people of color, a group that included mixed-race individuals, formerly enslaved people who had bought their freedom, and in many cases, men who owned large plantations and dozens of enslaved people themselves. Some of them were extraordinarily wealthy by any standard of the era, and none of that wealth bought them a single legal right. This is the part of the story that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around, because the cruelty of it was so deliberate and so specific. A free black man in Saint-Domingue could own 100 acres and 50 slaves, and have more money sitting in his accounts than most white colonists would see in a lifetime. And he still could not sit beside a white man in a theater. He could not eat at the same table. He could be publicly humiliated, beaten, or killed, and the legal system would offer him nothing in return. The colonial code governing Saint-Domingue ran to over 100 specific regulations dictating what free people of color could wear, where they could walk, and who they could speak to. The white planter class had built these rules deliberately because they understood, on some level, that the entire structure depended on keeping every possible coalition from forming. If the free people of color ever made common cause with the enslaved population, the math stopped working for everyone at the top, so they built a pressure cooker and convinced themselves it would hold. By the late 1780s, the French Revolution is beginning to tear through Paris, and word of it reaches Saint-Domingue and immediately sets off a debate among the white colonists about autonomy from France, taxation, and self-governance. Because apparently what the planter class was worried about in the middle of running the most brutal slave economy in the Western Hemisphere was whether they were being taxed fairly by Versailles. Free people of color, watching this unfold, send representatives to Paris to petition for their own rights under the new revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. The French Assembly more or less ignores them, when a free man of color named Vincent Auger returns to the island and leads a small armed uprising demanding political rights in 1790. Colonial authorities crush it within weeks, capture Auger, and execute him publicly by breaking him on the wheel. The message from the planter class was clear: nothing is changing, not for you. Then August 1791 arrives. A voodoo ceremony in the forest at Bois Caïman, led by a religious leader named Duddy Boukman, is widely cited as the organizing moment that lit the fuse. What happened in the days that followed was unlike anything the colonial world had ever seen. Enslaved people across the northern province rose up simultaneously, and they did not stop. Within days, plantations across the north were burning. Slaveholders were killed. By the time the French colonial government understood what was actually happening, hundreds of plantations had already been destroyed, and tens of thousands of people were moving through the countryside in coordinated groups that no one had planned for and no one knew how to stop. The colonial militia was completely overwhelmed. The local government sent desperate messages to France asking for soldiers and got bureaucratic delays in return. And then it gets even more chaotic, because now every faction on the island is moving at once. White colonists are still fighting each other about autonomy from France. Free people of color, having watched Auger die for asking politely, decide that armed struggle is the only language anyone on this island understands, and launch their own campaigns for legal equality. Spain, which controls the eastern side of Hispaniola, sees an opportunity and starts encouraging the uprising on the French side, hoping to grab territory. Britain, watching a French colony implode during a period when France and Britain are at war, decides this is a perfect moment to invade and sends its own forces to the western coast. In the span of a few years, what started as a slave uprising has become a four-way war with two foreign armies fighting on the same island as two completely different colonial factions, all of them simultaneously trying to win, and none of them remotely in control of what they had unleashed. And out of this complete chaos, four different factions, two foreign armies, and a colony burning from one end to the other, a formerly enslaved coachman named Toussaint Louverture was about to become the most dangerous man in the Western Hemisphere. Toussaint Louverture was in his late 40s when the revolution started, which is a strange time in life to become the most feared military commander in the Caribbean. He had spent most of his life as a coachman on the Breda plantation, and unlike most of the people around him, he had taught himself to read. He had been quietly studying books on military strategy and history for years, absorbing the campaigns of great generals the way other men memorized prayers. When Saint-Domingue erupted in 1791, Toussaint saw exactly what was happening and understood it better than almost anyone else on the island. He doesn't immediately join the rebellion. Instead, he spends a brief period helping his former enslaver's family escape safely before joining the forces, fighting under Spanish command. Because Spain was the most powerful enemy of France in the region and had promised freedom to enslaved men who fought for them. But then something changes everything. In 1794, the French revolutionary government abolishes slavery entirely, becoming the first major colonial power in the Western Hemisphere to do so. And Toussaint switches sides almost immediately. This wasn't impulsive. He understood that France, at that specific moment in history, was the only power offering what he actually wanted. He brings his army with him, turns on his former Spanish commanders, and begins pushing them out of the territory he had just been defending for them. By the time the Spanish are gone, the British have arrived. Britain sends around 20,000 men to seize Saint-Domingue, while France is distracted by revolution at home. Figuring the island would be an easy grab, it was not. Toussaint runs a guerrilla campaign against the British that is absolutely brutal to watch from their side. Ambushes in jungle terrain, supply lines cut, coordinated strikes on fortified positions, and underneath all of it, yellow fever tearing through British ranks at a rate their commanders cannot explain or stop. Somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 British soldiers die in Saint-Domingue. Britain negotiates a withdrawal in 1798 and quietly agrees never to interfere with the island again. Toussaint has just defeated one of the most powerful militaries on Earth. By 1801, he controls the entire island, the Spanish eastern half included, and drafts a constitution that permanently abolishes slavery and names him governor for life while keeping the territory nominally tied to France. Napoleon, who has just consolidated power in Paris and has his own plans to restore the plantation economy and the slave trade that was making France rich, reads this constitution and is furious. He sends his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, with 40,000 of France's finest soldiers to take the island back and reimpose the system Toussaint had just dismantled. Toussaint fights them to a standstill for months. Leclerc cannot beat him in the field, so he tries something else. He invites Toussaint to peace negotiations, guarantees his safety, and then arrests him the moment he arrives. It's one of the more obvious betrayals in this entire era. Toussaint is put on a ship and taken to Fort de Joux, a cold stone prison in the French Alps, and left there. He dies in 1803. Before he died in that freezing French prison, Toussaint told his captors that they had only felled the trunk. The roots of Black Liberty were still in the ground and would shoot up again, and within a year, he was proven completely right. With Toussaint gone, his generals kept fighting, and the French army, already half destroyed by yellow fever, couldn't hold on. Leclerc himself dies of the disease, and the men he brought with him are dying at a rate the French command back in Paris hadn't remotely anticipated when they sent 40,000 of their best soldiers across the Atlantic to put down a slave rebellion. The remnants of that army are crushed at the Battle of Vertières in November 1803, which is essentially the last real engagement of the war, and after that, there's nothing left to fight over. On January 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stands up and declares independence, renaming the country Haiti, the original Taino name for the island, reclaiming something that had been stripped away centuries earlier. It's the first black republic in the history of the world, and the only slave revolt that didn't just succeed militarily, but actually resulted in a functioning nation. That is an almost incomprehensible achievement given everything that had been thrown at these people. And then France does something that is almost too brazen to believe. They refuse to recognize Haiti's independence, not unless Haiti agrees to pay reparations, and not to any victims of the violence, but to the former French slaveholders as compensation for the human beings who had freed themselves. The people who had been treated as property were now being asked to pay the people who had owned them, or face a naval blockade and the very real threat of being invaded and re-enslaved. Haiti, a brand new country with no allies and no leverage, agrees in 1825 to pay 150 million francs. To cover it, they borrow from French banks, which means they're paying interest on top of the principal, which means the debt compounds, which means it doesn't go away. Economists who have studied this estimate the total lost development from that money leaving Haiti, instead of being reinvested in Haiti, runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The only nation in history founded specifically as a repudiation of slavery and greed spent the next 122 years writing checks to the slaveholders, and the last one cleared in 1947.